Having my hustle juice. This is Shamanic Coffee Hour. I actually have coffee today. I don't think I had coffee last time. Maybe I had finished my coffee. Today I'm drinking, and I am not sponsored by them, so this is not a paid endorsement of any sort. Um, I'm drinking Pete's coffee, uh, probably my favorite brand of coffee, and I think I'm drinking Big Bang coffee, which is a medium roast, and I love medium roast. So Pete's can feel free to sponsor me if they if they choose. Lots of coffee going on. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, no matter where you're tuning in from. Um, been talking a lot about spiritual awakening, the process of spiritual awakening. Good morning. I've been talking about the spiritual awakening as a process and as an experience and as something that a lot of people are shooting for. Today I thought it would be I don't know if fun is the right word. Um, One thing about spiritual awakening is it can give you a dark sense of humor, which seems really weird. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for joining. And as you see, like if you at least if you're on Facebook or YouTube, your comments will pop up here. So I'm able to, if I can read them, I'm able to respond to them. And questions or whatever, feel free. So we're talking about spiritual awakening and as a process, not a destination. And I want to kind of make that clear because there, in a lot of, not just a lot, almost every spiritual system, that involves some sort of enlightenment teaching or awakening teaching, there's a destination. There's get here, this is it, this is the end of the line. And I don't think that that's true. And this is my personal take, but I think there's no end to the depth of awakening that can happen. And I think everybody gets a different experience of that. There are very technical schools, technical mystery schools, technical enlightenment schools where like these are the six signs, and once you get here, you are where we want you to be. Um, but there's those are different places for it for all of these schools. And when questioned, there are people who research this stuff. Um, Everybody has a very different experience of spiritual enlightenment, enlightenment or spiritual awakening, or lots of different terms for it. Right, God consciousness, absorption, um, a new one is ascension. There's all kinds of stuff out there. So today I thought it would be fun, and I'm giggling again. Spiritual awakening can give you a little bit of a dark sense of humor, um, but I'll talk about why that is actually. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about what I call the dark side of spiritual awakening, or the stuff that the a lot of people don't point to and say, look, this can happen, you can experience this. However, it's all okay, it's all cool, it's all fine. And one of the hallmarks of spiritual awakening is an underlying sense of everything being okay. uh, f- Researchers call that fundamental well-being, right? That there's a sense that all this drama that's out here, whatever's going on for this body, whatever's going on for, in the quote unquote outside world. Again, there's no outside world. Everything you're perceiving is happening in your experience. Everything's okay. Everything is just fine. That can be really hard to grasp in the very beginning because spiritual awakening sometimes comes as the result of crisis, personal crisis. It's kind of like spirit forcing you to recognize that everything's okay, that you're going to get through this. And that can be very dramatic. For example, I know people who have had near death. Good morning. I know people who have had near death experiences that got an awakening experience out of that. And of course, the near death experience is extremely traumatic. You feel like It's going to be the end of you. It's an existential threat. And then you realize, oh, wait, there is no end. There's no beginning. There's no end. Time's kind of uh, time's kind of an illusion, and space is kind of an illusion, and all of this stuff out here is just arising in consciousness. So, um, I want to talk about some of the unpleasant things that can happen that a lot of people don't recognize. And in some and I'm not putting any system down, and I never ever want to do that. In some sort of new age oriented systems, there's not a recognition of things like the dark night of the soul, or even shadow work is, just head for the light, head for the light, head for the light, forgetting that both light and shadow are parts of the same system. They're two sides of the same coin. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And the reason I want to talk is not to scare people away from spiritual practice or awakening practices or whatever. And thank you for just joining. I don't want to scare anybody away from that. I want people to recognize that these things can happen and that they're fine. They're perfectly okay. In the moment, it will not feel like they're fine. But if somebody had told me when I went through a very serious dark night of the soul experience, somebody told me that was okay, or I understood what that was, I don't know, maybe I would have passed through quicker or had a different experience of that. I did not. I felt like my life was coming to an end. And in a way, it does. Your old life comes to an end as new life begins, and that's what spiritual initiation is. Initiation always involves a little death of sorts and a new birth of sorts. It's why we have things like, in Christian church, we have being born again or baptism, and it's being born in spiritual light. It's a rebirth. And in many initiatory traditions, they will simulate the death experience and a resurrection experience. There's a very good reason for that. It's shedding off the old stuff essentially is incredibly important. And that's a lot of what the dark side stuff is. Um, so I'm going to talk about a few things that can happen along the way. And again, I think spiritual awakening is a process that doesn't necessarily ever end. Like can just become deeper and deeper and deeper the more you go on. And you can kind of go through these phases. The other thing, I think it's a mistake to think I'm going to land here, I'm going to be woke, spiritually awakened, enlightened, whatever. And that's where I'm going to live from now on. Many people have fluctuating experiences of awakening, of enlightenment, and you can get these really high peaks, for lack of a better term, high peak enlightenment experiences, completely non-dual absorption into the universe, all of these things, and then come out of it. And that can be like crashing. And that's probably one of the first dark side things that I'll explore, is that many awakening experiences are temporary. Which is fine. That's just the way it happens. Like, you'll reach a state and you'll come out of it. You're not quite ready to be there permanently yet. You may achieve a new baseline of consciousness, or you might not. And either way, again, things are fine. It's totally okay. So, you can sort of have these new experiences. Awakening is about a complete shift in consciousness. The way that you perceive everything changes. That's one of the ways that that it's happened. Um, Contrast this with sort of mental health experiences, like we can have a psychotic break, or all of these things. And sometimes those things go hand in hand with spiritual awakening too. With spiritual awakening, when you come out of that experience, whatever that harsh experience is, you'll feel better than you did when you went into it. It's a temporary, any sort of psychosis things that we might call psychosis would be temporary. It would probably not respond to any sort of medication or therapy or that sort of thing, but you would come out of it at the end. Where if it's a persistent state, it's probably an organic or otherwise mental health concern. And if you have concerns about mental health, you should seek out a mental health professional rather than going to a shaman or just meditating your way through it. Not to say you can't practice spirituality while you are seeking out therapy or help, but be healthy, do the wise thing. Um, so sometimes awakening experiences can happen as the result of crisis, or they can kick crisis into high gear. I've talked about this a lot in my own personal story, but if I went through a personal mental and physical health crisis, um, I don't know, in my very early 40, late 30s, early 40s. Um, and it almost was the end of me. I was losing weight. I couldn't put weight back on. I um, uh, couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't. All kinds of things were going on. I was severely depressed, having flashbacks, having all kinds of experiences. I didn't know what was going on. What was happening for me is that I was going through a dark night of the soul. And you don't necessarily have just one of those on your pathway. It can happen again and again. Um, but I'll talk about, let me, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable. I'm going to talk about some of my own story here because I think not because I'm important or more important than anybody else or whatever, but just to illustrate a little bit about what can happen. So again, I had this dark night of the soul. I've had a number of spiritual awakening experiences, um, and have some stabilized sense of fundamental well-being and non-duality and all of those things, as well as experiencing some peak experiences. And um, you know, recently I was doing some work on my own. I was with my partner, but also doing some work on my own, and some very sad memories came up spontaneously after some work, some meditation work, some deeper shadow work, and whatever. Some very very sad memories, and so knew what happens so on the physical level when spiritual awakening experiences happen. There is a rewiring of your neurology. There is some changes to your system that happen that can be measured. That's not the totality of experience. There's a very spiritual component, but this body will have a rewiring. And so spontaneously some very sad for me memories came up for me, and I was um I began to cry. Tears just came down my face, and my partner was came over to comfort me. She's absolutely fantastic person, and just really really compassionate, and um she came over to comfort me, and she's like, "What can I do?" And this and that. And I go, "No, this is good." Like this, it's weird. We think sometimes, oh, feeling sad is bad. Feeling I don't like that. It's an uncomfortable feeling. It's whatever. I knew, again, there's a fundamental sense that whatever's going on for this body and this mind and this reality is okay. And I knew, like, okay, my this neurology is processing some emotion, some raw emotion from some experiences that I had. And tears were coming down my face, and there was an experience of sadness. um but how I would describe that is that I was very detached from it. I was watching it, I was observing it. I was observing the sadness arising, and the physiological response, the tears and whatever. And that was that I processed it, and I felt great afterwards. um this is one of the things that can happen, is that you get a little bit You can take observer position. And in some sort of levels, I guess, for lack of a better term, of spiritual awakening, there is non-duality even with yourself. Like there's an experience that this body and mind is part of your experience, but it's not who you are. Okay, that's the ego that says I'm the body or I'm my thoughts or whatever. I had thoughts, I had emotions, I had a body, I had a physiological response to that. Um, None of that is who I am. Who I am is this awareness. This body that is speaking to you seems weird to say this maybe, but this is not who I am. This image that you have of me on the screen, that's not who I am. Who I am is pure awareness. That's also who you are. So underneath it all, we are the same thing, is fundamental pure awareness. So once you grok that, and by grok, I mean grok's kind of a nerd term for understanding, but it's not intellectual understanding, it's experiential understanding. It's a very different thing. I can read every book in the world about spirituality, enlightenment, or whatever, but if I don't have the experience of it, I haven't really understood. It's like I can read a book about baking cakes, but that isn't the same experience as baking a cake, right? I can read a book about playing basketball, but that's not playing basketball. So intellectual understanding is great, is fine. I have an immense spiritual library. Um, so much so that it's become a little I've had to put lots of books into boxes and storage and stuff. Um, so that can happen. One thinks that after spiritual awakening there are no more bad feelings, right? I just live in a state of bliss all the time. And it's true that your emotions will shift and that the feeling that you can experience is at certain levels of awakening is akin to an underlying bliss and peacefulness. And that's beautiful and it's definitely worthwhile to pursue that. At other levels of awakening, um, your experience of emotion seems to go away and you almost have no emotions um, for a period of time. That can definitely happen. And what's happening is that you're detaching. Emotions have a very physiological component to them, right? We'd say, I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel whatever, feel happy. Um, we move away from being attached to the body as our identity. We still have a body, still, can experience having a body, experience the outside world looking through these eyes, whatever. But it feels less and less like it's you. And so in that case, lots of things seem less important. This is one of the unexpected things that can happen with awakening. Uh, and it doesn't. Again, everybody has a different experience of it. Everybody might experience things to different levels. Um, your need for social approval lessens as your ego attachment to your body and mind lessens. Your need for social approval lessens, and this is why I think, and I certainly have had this desire. This is why I think a lot of mystics go off and live on their own. Like, I don't really need social approval. I'm just going to focus on developing myself. I'm a very social person. I grew up being very extroverted. Um, was a performing artist for a lot of my life. Did acted on plays, did TV, did radio, did all kinds of stuff. Public speaking. I love public speaking. I love doing this. I love doing this stuff. Uh, but less and less you rely on other people, and so people can sometimes become more socially isolated. Not in a I'm depressed and I don't want to see other people way. It's just that people's seeking approval becomes less important. Along with that becomes less attachment to material things, symbols of status, that sort of thing. Those aren't necessarily bad things, but people don't necessarily expect them. And the point of this talk today is to help people have some expectations about what is, what might be happening with them as they're going through spiritual awakening experiences. And I think lots and lots and lots of people are right now and not even necessarily aware of this is what's happening to me. Um, I touched briefly on the dark night of the soul, and I will talk about that a little more in depth. So this is an expression that comes out of sort of mystic Christianity, the dark night of the soul. I think it comes from Saint John of the Cross, and it was coined when somebody is going through a profound spiritual experience, and as it implies, is a dark night of the soul. It's a time of confusion. It can be a time of tumult, emotional distress, or depression, or all of these things. Um, and the way it's described by people of faith is that it can challenge your faith, right? It can challenge your faith in that how could how could there be a God if I'm going through this horrible, horrible experience, and all of that. And we know, it's the dark night of the soul because you come out of it. There's a mourning. You pass through that. It is um the next day you wake up from your dark night of the soul and things are better than they were before. And if you're a person of faith, maybe your faith is strengthened. If you're a person of spiritual practice, your sense of um underlying connection to the universe is strengthened. If your sense of peace, your sense of bliss, all of that might have, should and might have been strengthened by that experience. That's how we know it's a dark night of the soul and not simple psychological crisis. um so yeah, we come out of it. You come out of dark night of the soul. And I remember somebody like having a really, really profound negative experience, and somebody spoke something to me in a moment that I think was from spirit, and I don't think this person even realized they were saying it, and it was the thing that I needed to hear right at that moment. And the switch from horrible, I want to die, to wow, everything is okay, was instantaneous. Hard to describe. Absolute, night and day, dark night of the soul to daylight of the soul, I guess, awakening. And it happened so quickly. It was astonishing to me. But I have had other experiences like that, experiences of sudden awakening. Now, all spiritual awakening experiences are not sudden like that. Sometimes people move very gradually into spiritual awakening. And again, that's fine. There are all paths lead to God, as some people say. All paths lead to spiritual awakening, enlightenment, all of those things. So, if you're just joining, good morning or afternoon or evening, whatever, wherever it is, we're talking about some of the darker aspects of spiritual awakening that aren't always called out, aren't always explained in different spiritual systems and by different spiritual teachers. Um, so, Dark Night of the Soul is one of those. What's going on in my understanding, my experience of the dark night of the soul is that there is, in order for you to experience a more purified consciousness, are a lot of our conditioning, a lot of our negative conditioning, from our upbringing, from our education, from our culture, from all of these things, has to be quote unquote burned off. And a dark night of the soul experience does that very rapidly, right? It's like you're sick, um, you get a fever, and what fever does is it actually boosts your immune system. For every degree of fever, your immune system is boosted something like 10%. Fever has a purpose. It's why now they're recommending, unless your fever is dangerously high, don't reduce it with medication, because it's your body healing itself. It's your body burning off, fighting disease. So I guess dark night of the soul is like a spiritual fever. It's your spiritual immune system fighting off the stuff that isn't you, clearing it out, getting rid of it. And what's left is a more purified state, a more purified you, or experience of you. You can't purify you, who you are. You're already pure. And I'm not a big fan of the concept of things like original sin, or the fact that you're born broken, or that you're imperfect in any way. Underneath all of this stuff, this drama, you're whole, complete, and perfect just as you are. You're unborn, you're undying, you're unwoundable, all of those things. It's just that we have a lot of stuff built up on top of that. And that kind of gets, a lot of that gets burned away when we go through a dark night of soul experience. Um, so on the subject of darkness and moving in that direction, about the dark side of the light. I want to talk a little bit about the shadow, and I've done a lot of classes and teaching and stuff about shadow work. It's one of my favorite things to do and talk about. So I won't go tremendously in depth about the shadow here. I've done lots of videos about the shadow, and I'll do a coffee hour talk just about shadow and shadow work at some point. But the shadow is a term coined by Carl Jung, and it talks about the exiled parts of ourselves. So the parts of ourselves that are unconscious, and they're unconscious because we have been told, or we believe, that they are bad, and it is painful for us to look at them. This includes traumas, secret desires, secret pain, all kinds of stuff, right? We just chuck that in the back. The poet Robert Bly describes the shadow as a big black bag that we're dragging behind us. So it's all kinds of stuff, also known as the exile, if you want to personify it, the exiled parts of ourselves. All of this stuff that we have going on. The importance of the shadow in spiritual work is that the shadow acts up in your life in ways that you don't expect and don't know. Anytime we're being reactive to something, anytime we're triggered, and if you've ever had an intense emotional reaction to something, and then said, where did that come from? Where it comes from is something in your shadow. Triggers are pointers to wounds that are in your shadow, things that you have hidden away because they're painful to look at. Um, greetings to you as well. Thank you for joining. Um, I should take that logo off because I can't always read the last comment. I don't know if I can do that. Let me see if I can remove the logo. Here we go. Oh, Reno, Nevada. It must be fairly early in Reno, Nevada at the moment. Here, I'll put my logo back. So the shadow, parts of ourselves that we've exiled, parts of ourselves that are painful to look at, we've been told. Again, this is part of our conditioning, right? Our parents say, it's not okay to be angry at your sister. So every time you get angry at your sister, you're punished or whatever. So you repress that anger you have at your sister. And sometimes we generalize that stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff in there. There are hidden sexual desires, hidden all kinds of stuff. And the lie about the shadow, the lie we tell ourselves about the shadow is, well, if I bring that stuff up, I'm going to become a serial killer, or I'm going to become, I'm not going to have morals or ethics or whatever. And that's not true. None of that's true. In fact, what is true is when you do act up, or when you do act in ways that are not consistent with your ethics, morals, your self-concept, any of those things, that's usually stuff coming out of your shadow. Your shadow will run your life from the background, like the wizard in The Wizard of Oz, the guy behind the curtain. That's what the shadow is. It will pop up in ways that are unexpected. So until you get a grasp of that, it's kind of running your life. Um, and Jung said that you don't become enlightened by just, seeking the light. You become enlightened by diving into the shadow and bringing stuff up. So, doing your work, doing your cleanup work is a really important part. What happens if you don't is that there are lots of examples of this. Um, so if you think about spiritual teachers, think about some spiritual teachers who have become famous or infamous for doing not so wonderful things, right? Abusing their followers, stealing money from their followers, suicide cults, all these things, right? And it's not to say these teachers don't have spiritual wisdom or haven't reached levels of awakening or whatever, but they haven't done their cleanup work. You would never behave that way if you hadn't addressed your shadow. And the problem is you can blind yourself by seeking more and more light. You can blind yourself to your shadow. You can form a bigger boundary between yourself and your exile. But real enlightenment, real and awakening, real depth of development comes from doing both. Comes from doing that cleanup work. There's waking up, growing up, and cleaning up, and all of those things are really important. Um, I followed a spiritual teacher who could demonstrate openly um, supernatural abilities. I witnessed things that I won't even begin to describe in the presence of this spiritual teacher back, I don't know, decades ago. I was in college, almost 30 years ago now. And um, this person wound up taking his own life, which is very sad, but clearly there was stuff there that hadn't healed. But he had reached a very high level of spiritual attainment, which is why I don't think, attainment is one path, right? Reaching for, I'm going for this thing. Um, that is a very divine masculine aspect of spiritual awakening, attainment. I'm headed down the path. And there's another aspect to that, which is very nurturing and is about realizing that we're all connected underneath and that we're all the same consciousness. Those things, that is a very divine feminine path. It's more of a left hand path. You can take a middle path and do both. I think too much imbalance definitely causes problems, clearly. And I know, spiritual teachers, very well respected spiritual teachers who essentially drank themselves to death, were, addicted to substances, or wound up abusing followers, or, all kinds of stuff have happened. And it's not to say these people haven't, we have this idea that spiritual attainment is commensurate with uh ethical behavior, and that is clearly not always the case. And so we might tell ourselves, well, these people really weren't that spiritual, then they were just lying, they were con men. And I don't think that that's true, because I've had experiences with folks who hadn't done their cleanup work, but had a very high level of spiritual wisdom and spiritual attainment. um so those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But that is a thought. That's a general thought that I've encountered out there in the world. So we've talked about dark night of the soul, talked about um, talked about the shadow and shadow work a little bit. And another thing I want to touch on is Do I think, uh, sorry, I gotta hide my logo for a second. You think some shadow parts arise from traumatic experiences? Yes, 100%. Some shadow aspects, trauma has, one of our survival mechanisms is to bury traumatic memories. Um, and that is important, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We don't always want to be confronted like with trauma. Until we're ready to clean that up. So yes, absolutely. Traumatic memories, traumatic experiences can be relegated to the shadow. And um I do a lot of work with trauma. I come from a background of trauma myself. And I can tell you that a lot of my, well, I'll give you an example. So, or triggers, for example, like there are certain things I've now recognized as, oh, that was triggered by a very specific traumatic experience. Somebody would do or say something to me, and I'm normally a very, even before spirituality took over my life, very even keeled person, never get angry, kind of thing. And somebody would say something to me, and I would snap into this anger, this rage, and um, fortunately never a violent person, but I would get extremely angry, and then afterwards like forget even why I got angry. um and that I can trace back to traumatic experiences. It was a survival response of, oh, this reminded me of something that happened to me that was traumatic, and but it was in my shadow, so I didn't know, I couldn't put those two together. So a thing you can do, and I recommend this for everybody. Gosh, what a good practice. A spiritual teacher gave me this practice to do for a month, but you could do it for as long as you wanted, is to keep a trigger journal. Every time something triggers you, every time you have this extreme reactive emotional response to something, it doesn't matter what it is, write it down. Write down, the time and date, where you were, and briefly what happened and what your reaction to that was. And then go back and look at that a month later. Read through all of those experiences. It will be eye opening. Not to say that it will necessarily cause flashbacks or anything like that, but it will be a pointer to things that are in your shadow. So it's a great question. And absolutely, I think that trauma is a big reason why we have the shadow parts that we do. Um, And trauma comes in lots of different forms. There's, what they call big T trauma, little T trauma. I don't like to compare trauma. And I realized like at the beginning of my experience with, I don't know, awakening or whatever, I was diagnosed with PTSD. And at the time I was like, how could I have PTSD? I've never been to war. I've never, I've never been in the military or, whatever. And I was comparing my experiences, which were very traumatic, to other people's. Well, how could I don't have it as bad as they do? And I think that's true. I think a lot of people with PTSD, particularly complex or developmental trauma, um, I think that's a very common experience to do that comparison thing and to maybe play it down. Well, you'll see people like, oh, my parents did this to me and I turned out okay. And you look at them and you're like, um, no, you didn't actually turn out okay. I'm sorry. But there's some stuff you haven't dealt with yet. So it's a very good question. Um, so I talked about the shadow and I talked about dark night of the soul. And I briefly touched on the fact that sometimes spiritual awakening can come with a decrease in um, the need for social approval. And the thing to be aware of there is that many of our interpersonal relationships are built on the need for social approval. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's bad or whatever. I'm not criticizing that. These brains are hardwired to make social connection because it's safer when we were, living in caves and, hunting mastodons to gather together. And so being outcast from your tribe back then was an existential threat. So we are designed to seek social approval. As we as you awaken spiritually, that becomes less important, to the point at which some mystics just leave society. You hear about these hermits that go off. Not people who have social anxiety disorder. That's not it at all. It's not like that at all. It's that you don't care. It's not that you it seems very callous when I say it like that. It doesn't matter. Like it's not important. It's not important seeking social approval. And so you give up a lot of the trappings of that. You give up um, things that, provide a sense of status in this world, like designer clothing, maybe not. If that was important to you before, might not be so important to you anymore. And going out and drinking with friends, or whatever. This is not to say you flip a switch and all of a sudden you give up all of your social interactions. I think that's a rare experience for people. And some people, like myself, um, I love teaching, and I love the connection with people, and I use that to serve, which I like. I love, it's part of this personality that still exists. I use that to serve, but I also use that to make connection and to deepen my own experience. And whoops, I said something that I actually get something back out of teaching. I think there's this weird idea out there that spiritual teachers should get nothing in return for spiritual teaching. And if that were true, nobody would ever become a spiritual teacher. It's not to say that you need to be greedy or self-centered or whatever, but everybody does something for a reason. You do something because you get something out of it, whether that is, I do it because it makes me feel good, or I do it because I get paid for it, or I do it because, whatever. And somebody said to me one time, this is a really harsh statement, but I was talking about, I don't remember what, but um, somebody said, if you're only doing something, um, if you do things only because you're being paid for it, like that is doing something that is against your own values. And I said, really? I said, would you show up to work tomorrow if they said they weren't going to pay you anymore? Well, no. Okay, so are you going against your values, or is that just sort of you're putting this really extreme view on something, right? Whether you love your job or not, you also value things like being able to eat and pay your mortgage, and you know pay for your kids to go to the dentist, and you value those things too. That doesn't mean it's going against your values. You have a system of values. So one of the things that can happen with spiritual awakening is that your value system can change. um things that were important to you before can become less important to you. um social social approval can be one of those things that can happen, and again, everybody has different experiences. um in the beginning of my spiritual journey, sitting in circle with other shamanic practitioners was incredibly important to me. And I was married at the time, and it was such a healing experience for me to sit in circle, that my wife at the time would say, why don't you go hang out with, quote unquote, those people, the people I was sitting in circle with. I got a lot out of that. um and this isn't to say that nowadays I would shun a drum circle or whatever. I would probably enjoy that significantly. I just don't do that very much. I don't meet with people very much in person anymore either. Um, Ever since the pandemic, I realized, it's much easier. And I would love to go visit my clients in Australia or Europe, but that's not always very practical. So, I mostly meet with people like this over Zoom or whatever. Um, so some of the other, so talked about Dark Night of the Soul, talked about the shadow aspect. I've talked about some shifts in values that can happen that some people, if you're viewing it as an outsider, can be sort of like, well, that's really not good. Like that person gave up all these things that were important to them before. And it's just a shift in values. When your underlying sense of reality shifts, it's pretty huge. It's pretty big. Now, there are, and not to scare anybody, but because this is only something I have read about. Um, there are folks who achieve significant levels of spiritual awakening that go through a period of time where physiologically they kind of shut down, where they might become catatonic or comatose for a period of time or whatever. That's pretty extreme. It's pretty rare. I've never experienced that. I've never witnessed that. I've read accounts of it. I've read academic accounts of it, so it seems pretty, they'll like, oh, it seems like um the neurology has gotten so compromised, not compromised is not the right term, but so altered. The neurology has gotten so altered that signs of life are even hard to detect. You've heard stories about, llamas who can go into a state of meditation so deep that their heartbeat is like 4 beats a minute, and they can stay there for really extended periods of time. Um, Most people cannot do that. Most people cannot do that consciously. Um, you know, but what happens is that, let's talk about the brain a little bit. Your consciousness is not located in your brain. Your brain is a receiver of consciousness, like a radio is a receiver of a radio signal. If you have a radio in your car and you're listening to a radio station and there are DJs speaking 30 miles away, the DJs are speaking 30 miles away. They're not, if you were, didn't have an idea of how technology works or whatever, you might think that there were people or gods or something that are living inside your radio. But the radio is receiving a signal and, doing that. So the brain is a receiver of consciousness, but this field of consciousness is non-local. Um, and it is one field that everything exists inside of, all experience exists inside of. But if you damage the brain, it can, through death or something, it can stop receiving, like a radio you break. Um, and if you wanted to, receive a different signal on your radio, you would change the frequency that you are receiving. You would change the wiring inside the radio. Now it's all digital, but you would adjust the wiring, adjust the circuitry inside the radio. When you shift your consciousness and you're still in your body, your brain gets new signals, very, very different signals. And gets rewired sometimes at very fundamental base levels, sometimes very primitive levels of your brain get rewired, and that can affect your physiology because your physiology is affected by your brain. This is not to say that your brain is the generator of consciousness, it's a receiver. A good way to think about it is we are the entire universe peering through a single set of eyes, differentiated through a brain. Like the brain is picking up the universe's field of consciousness, and you know, signals are coming in through the eyes, through the ears, through the skin, the sensory organs, but you also have memories, you also have programs, just have stuff like this experience of what you're seeing right now. Very little of that is actually produced by your sense organs. Very little of that is what you're actually seeing. That experience of that is tainted by the brain, but a rising in consciousness. If you looked at what the eyes actually saw, it'd be very, very distorted. First of all, it'd be upside down to what you're experiencing right now, and very distorted. And your eyes actually have to move constantly over things to make out shapes and stuff. We're just not normally aware of that. Okay. So there's this idea that our sense organs are the things that are doing the seeing. But if you close your eyes, you can still see. I realize some people don't have the experience of making pictures in their head, and that's actually a disconnection between the visual cortex and other parts of the brain. You still are making pictures in your brain. You're just not. They're not coming into um, a part of your brain that is receiving awareness. Um, even people, I've had students who are what they call aphantasic, who can't make pictures in their head, or they can't experience the pictures in their head. And I'll say, "What color is your mailbox?" And I go, "Blue." "How do you know that?" "I don't know. I just do. I know it's blue." Right. So something in them is experiencing that their mailbox is blue, and they're just not experiencing the pictures of it in that part of their brain. So the brain's really interesting. So the brain, when awakening experiences happen, gets rewired. Your neurology starts to change. Neuroplasticity um, kicks in, and your experience of the world changes. Your filters change. Your, you know, because you're tuning it to a different frequency of consciousness. You can become very detached. You can have in non-dual experience. You can experience the body. There's an expression. I'm sorry, I'm starting to lose words here. I'm going in and out of different states of consciousness as I'm trying to explain this, and some of those I lose the words for it. Believe it or not, if anybody knows me and they go, "Oh, you're never at a loss for words," that's not exactly true. Um, there is in the rewiring of the brain, and there are states where they'll say, "Be not the doer." You are not the doer. The body and the speech coming out, and the even the things receiving perceptions does not feel like who you are. And at deeper levels, there is a lack of sense of volition. That seems weird, like you're giving up control of your body. I think this is where some people start to feel like they're possessed, like my body's doing stuff and I'm not doing it. And that's not possession. That's something different. Um there's a sense of lack of volition. Your body is carrying through your intentions, and you're aware that there are sensations, you're aware that your body is doing stuff, but it doesn't feel like it's you that's in control. You're hanging back here in observation. Oh, you've got work to do. Thanks for joining again. Um, oh, yeah, yeah. I'm glad. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad that that helped explain many periods of your life, and that is exactly why I want to do these talks. It took me a really long time to figure out what I was going through in different periods of my life as well, and so I think the more that we demystify is such a weird word. The more that we demystify the stuff and talk about it, um, we can all share experiences that we've had with others, and people it can help people through these experiences. Um, you know, when I talk to clients, very often they're going through spiritual initiation, had aphantasia, and after a lot of inner work, I've started getting my mind's eyes back. Interesting, yeah. Cool, yeah. I'll do shadow work next. I'll probably talk about that next. Speaking on a theme, so stay tuned. Yeah, I know shamanic practitioners that have aphantasia, and yeah, you can part sometimes aphantasia can be the result of trauma, and so doing inner work can clear that up. There is, I've never had aphantasia, so I don't know for first hand, but there is something called image streaming, um, which is a process by Win Wenger. I think the guy's name is WinWnger. And supposedly, some people have tried image streaming processes. I almost said processes. Speaking Canadian today, processes. Some people have tried that and actually been able to get past aphantasia. I was reading an article by a photographer who used image streaming, who had aphantasia and was not able to set up I think it's a him, his shots ahead of time because he couldn't picture in his head. And was able to work through that using image streaming. But sometimes aphantasia is the result of sometimes it's the result of a brain injury, and that is organic, and but sometimes it's the result of trauma. So doing inner work can clear that. Anyone found themselves in spontaneous yoga mudra poses and not knowing where they came from? Yes. Yeah. Yes. That's happened to me, and that has happened to many people that I have read about and people that I've known. Spontaneous um, movements of energy through the system can, and if you go with it, if you let go, you can let the body do natural poses. And I'll talk about, I can briefly, I'm almost out of time, but I can briefly talk about an experience that I had. Gosh, 30 something years ago. I was studying martial arts, studying jujitsu, a Japanese martial art in Boston. This was around 1996. And a group of teachers from Japan of all different types of martial arts, really high level martial arts teachers came over to do a demo as part of a cultural exchange in Boston one time. And they reached out to our school and some others and said, if you guys before the demo, if you guys want to come out and train with the teachers during their practice, you can just come out and train. And I was like, heck yeah, I'm gonna do that. And it was really cool because there were sumo wrestlers and archers and karate guys and aikido guys and all this stuff. And I decided there were kendo guys, right? So kendo is Japanese sword. It's the sword fencing, the guys in the armor with the bamboo swords. And I'd never done kendo before. Never picked up a kendo sword in my life. No idea what I was doing. But so I went and stepped out onto the mat when we were invited to train with these kendo teachers, and they handed us bamboo swords, and I held the bamboo sword and kind of like went into a light trance, not on purpose. And the teacher, there was an assistant who was doing translation. He was Japanese, but he spoke fluent English. And the teacher didn't speak any English. So the teacher runs over and starts saying something in very rapid Japanese to the uh, assistant, and the assistant translates to me. He says that he would like to know where you learned how to hold a sword. I was very excited about this, like excited in almost a disturbed way, right? When I say excited, just like high emotion comes over. Here's a guy who's very calm and whatever comes over, blah 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 blah. Right? I'm sorry, I don't speak Japanese, so I can't do that. Rapid Japanese speaking, and he says he would like to know where you learned how to hold the sword. And I said, I don't. I don't know. Like I didn't. This seems the way to hold it. And he says something back in Japanese. There's more conversation. He comes back and he goes, you're holding the sword right, and it takes us a long time. Takes us a very long time to teach people how to do that, and you just picked it up and held the sword right. So there's something to be said for certain physical manifestations of spirit, past life returns, spirit moving through us and putting us into positions where we're supposed to be. I have had spontaneous mudras and yoga poses, and I have read about that happening with other people and know other people who that's happened to. So that is a spiritual experience that some people have. So I'm assuming if you're asking about it, that's happened to you. You're very welcome. I assume that that's happened to you. I would not be disturbed by it. I would, when it's happening, I think the thing to do is to welcome and observe as much as possible, allow as much as possible. And again, some people might go, "Oh, I'm possessed. My body's moving on its own accord." The body moves on its own accord all the time. It's called ideomotor action. Um, when I go when I think tie my shoes, I don't, when I was 6 years old or however old I was learning to tie my shoes, I had to think about every loop and every whatever. You don't think about that anymore. Your body just does it, right? I just tie my shoes without thinking about each motion in between. The body is moving on its own accord. We have muscle memory. Sometimes that muscle memory is spirit moving through us, or a past life return, something you did in a past life. Feels really like that might be the case here as well. Um, I know for me, I'm not a good dancer, but that doesn't stop me. Again, if you give up the need for social approval, shame goes away and you just do whatever you want to do. And that for me, and lucky my kids aren't easily embarrassed because I'm all like, if there's music, I'm dancing. And I remember I was taking them through a drive-through coffee place one time and they had music playing outside. And I'm like, rocking. It was a song I'd never heard before. And the young women who worked inside, they were like leaned out the window and were like, "Oh," they're like, "Do you like this song?" I'm like, "Yeah, I do like this song. It's great. I can really move to it." And they started talking to me about music, and I'm like, I had like a 15-minute conversation through a drive-through window with two young women about music, who happen to have, in my very similar taste to my music. I was like, "Oh, I love this group and I love that group," and I was mentioning a lot of older stuff as I'm older, and even stuff a little bit before my time, and they knew all of it. So they were music fans, and I appreciated that. But I cannot almost stop myself from moving sometimes, particularly if there's music, and it's not just a dance thing. But I've done a lot of body oriented work in my lifetime: martial arts, qigong, yoga, tai chi, all kinds of stuff. So there is there was I have to end soon, but I'll tell another really brief personal story that I was training in martial arts many, many years ago with my main teacher in jujitsu, and he had very different ways of teaching. It's what I liked about him. In ways of, you know that you really, really got stuff, really understood stuff, and we were doing these what we called foot movements, or ashi sabaki, which is foot shifting. It's like you take a step to the left, take a step to the right, take a step in this diagonal direction, take a step in this. And I remember there was a time where it was supposed to be like a 3-hour practice. I think he extended it to 5 hours or something. And we did the same movement for the entire time, the same movement. What happens, and then this helped me out with meditation later in life. What happens is at about 20 minutes, you're like, when is this going to end? When is he going to stop making us do this movement? At about 40, 45 minutes, that drops away and your mind gets really, really, your mind is tired of fighting with you, and that drops away. After that point, at some point after that point, you lose track of time and the movement is happening, but you're not making it happen, right? The movement is just occurring, and I was completely blissed out. I was completely in this state of utter peace and bliss, and my body was just movement. And I'm sure it would have eventually given out, but if he had never stopped us from doing that, if he never said, "Okay," and um, I would have been perfectly content until I collapsed or something. But again, this for me now, looking back, that was a spiritual experience that was it was a form of meditation. He didn't teach that way. Oh, we're going to do this form of meditation. He didn't explain what we were doing. We just did it and had the experience. Some Native American cultures call that coyote teaching. It's where you kind of trick people into learning something. Um, and I sometimes use that in my teaching as well. I use it a lot. When I have taught martial arts, I use that a lot. Because if you tell people, sometimes the conscious mind gets in the way of learning. Um, and so you move past that. And so I had this experience, and a lot of people have the experience of meditation where they'll sit down and in the first 5 minutes, the first half an hour, whatever, their mind is going crazy. The monkey mind is just driving them nuts, right? When are you going to stop? This is so boring. This is horrible. Let's think about this. Let's think about that. Scratch your nose, shift your posture, whatever. And the mistake that people make is that they quit in that moment. They're like, "Oh, I can't do this." And I cannot tell you how many people I've had say to me, "I can't meditate because I can't stop my thoughts." It's not your job to stop your thoughts. It's your job to watch your thoughts, and your thoughts will stop eventually, in meditation, but it takes time. It doesn't happen instantaneously. And yeah, in the beginning, it's feels like it's going to drive you crazy. But if you never have, meditate for an hour. If you've never meditated for an hour, do it. Watch the breath. Do it. Whatever form of meditation speaks to you. Do it for an hour, um, and just sit through the monkey mind fighting you over that. There will come a moment, usually somewhere between a half an hour or 45 minutes in, where the mind just gets tired. You're wearing it out, right? The mind just gets tired and goes, "All right, whatever." It's at the all right, whatever point that you go, "Whoa," and everything becomes peaceful and blissful, and you're floating, and that's when the real meditation happens. That's when meditation begins. Not when you sit down, not when you close your eyes, not when you're fighting your monkey mind or staring at your nose or whatever it is you're doing. It's it happens, but you're not making it happen. That's the thing. Meditation is not forced. It's not an effort. In fact, if you're efforting, you're probably not doing it right. And not to say that there isn't effort in the beginning. There is. It's the giving, it's the when you get too tired and you give up the effort, that's when meditation happens. That's when true deep meditation happens. Anyway, I've been chatting for a bit over an hour, and thank you very much for joining me today. I want to say, I try to say this, and I realize it can sound kind of weird, but I love you all. I do. We're all one underneath all of this, and I want to extend my loving, accepting approval to each and every one of you, wherever you are, whatever your background is, whatever your spiritual journey, whatever your path or no path or um, belief system or religion or spirituality. Um, have a good day. Have a good day at work. You have a beautiful day as well. Thank you so much for joining me. And I will do this again probably next week. And I will try to remember to do shadow work. Maybe I'll set that up so that I remember next week. Thanks for joining. And don't forget to subscribe so you know when I'm going to do this again if you want to